I sing for Maya. I don't talk to you." The words, clear and sharp as shards of ice, hung in the air of the multi-million-dollar nursery. They came from the lips of a 6-year-old girl, Seraphina Sterling, the child of the world. And more importantly, her father, Julian Sterling, believed to have been mute for the last 3 years. Julian stood frozen in the doorway, his custom-tailored Savile Row suit suddenly feeling tight across his chest. He wasn't hearing an explanation. He was hearing a declaration of war, a renunciation from his own bloodline. His eyes swept over the scene of this rebellion. His daughter, Seraphina, stood small but resolute, her sapphire blue eyes no longer those of an innocent victim, but of someone with intent. Behind her, like a silent sentinel, was Maya Evans, the nanny, the black woman he had hired out of desperation, a concession to the failure of Manhattan's most expensive specialists. Her hand still rested lightly on Seraphina's shoulder, a gesture that was both protective and a quiet assertion of power. Beside them was the ivory-white Steinway grand piano, its keys still humming with the ghost of an aria that, just seconds before, had filled the penthouse with an unbearable beauty. Julian's rage finally found its voice, scalding and raw. "What?" he rasped. "What did you just say?" But Seraphina didn't answer. Her task was complete. She had fired her arrow. Now, she took a step back, melting behind Maya, and the wall of silence Julian had grown so accustomed to was instantly rebuilt. Julian shifted his target, his gaze like twin laser drills bored into Maya. "You," he hissed. "What did you do to her? What have you been feeding into her head?" This was the real enemy, an outsider who had breached his meticulously controlled fortress, planting seeds of rebellion in the barren soil he called a family. Maya didn't flinch. She met her employer's gaze with a look Julian had never seen on any staff member. It wasn't brazen defiance. It was the terrifying calm of someone who held all the cards. "I didn't do anything, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice even but resonant, "except treat Seraphina like a human being, not a failed project." Failed project. The words were a slap to his pride. He had spent millions. He had consulted with the greatest medical minds. He had done everything. The best specialists diagnosed her with a severe neurological disorder. And you, a nanny with no medical training, dare to suggest they were wrong? The contempt in his voice was thick. He was trying to use his money, his status, to reassert his reality, to push this uncomfortable truth back into its box. "Specialists diagnose what they're told to look for," Maya replied, her words delicate but devastatingly precise. "They were looking for a broken child because that's what you pay them to find. I was looking for a child, and I found a genius." "Genius?" Julian barked a dry, bitter laugh. "A child who hasn't spoken a word in 3 years? That's your delusion. You've taught her a few tricks, a few rehearsed lines to impress me. This charade ends here. You're fired. Get out of my house. Now." He turned his back, a definitive gesture meant to end this insane conversation. But it was then that Seraphina did something no one expected. She stepped out from behind Maya, picked up a drawing from the table, and handed it to her father. Her small hand trembled, but her eyes did not. Julian frowned, taking the paper reluctantly. He expected a childish scribble. It wasn't. On the page were perfectly drawn musical staves. Notes were carefully penned, forming a complex, melancholic melody. It was the very aria he had heard moments before. And underneath, in the unsteady handwriting of a child just learning to write, was a single line, "The music for when you don't look at me." The air was sucked out of the room. Julian stared at the sheet music. He was no musician, but he was intelligent enough to recognize this was not something a normal child could create. This was a composition, an expression, and it was an indictment. He looked up at his daughter, truly looked at her for the first time. He no longer saw a defective child. He saw an intelligent stranger, a profound soul who had been living right under his nose, hidden by his own pride and prejudice. The internal collapse was silent but violent. But Julian Sterling was not a man who admitted error, especially not to someone he considered his inferior. His face hardened, masking the panic churning within. He shoved the paper into his pocket, as if it were a piece of trash. "Security will see you out," he said to Maya, his voice as cold as ice, refusing to meet his daughter's gaze. But as he said it, he knew he had already lost. The battle had just begun, and he had been defeated by the very first shot, a shot fired by his own daughter's voice. The heavy penthouse door boomed, shut behind Maya Evans, its sound echoing down the marble hallway like the final shot in a battle just lost. But Maya knew this wasn't an end. It was the declaration of war. She didn't look back. In her handbag was a phone that was less a communication device and more an encrypted arsenal, holding 2 months of meticulously documented evidence of a genius held captive. Inside the gilded fortress, meanwhile, Julian Sterling was desperately trying to reconstruct the order that had been shattered. His initial, hot rage had cooled into a chilling fear. He had seen a crack in his foundation, and he would seal it at any cost. His first act was swift and merciless. He strode into Seraphina's room, where she sat huddled on a plush armchair, clutching the sheet music to her chest. He said nothing. He simply snatched the paper from her grasp, tore it into small, fluttering pieces, and let them fall into a leather-lined wastebasket. Seraphina's eyes widened in horror, but no tears fell. She just watched the fragments of her melody lie there, dead and silent. "There will be no more music," Julian declared, his voice devoid of anger, possessing only the cold finality of steel. "No more tricks. You will be normal again." His normal meant silent. He summoned the housekeeper, Carmen, and gave his orders. The piano was to be removed and put into storage. All books, all drawing pads, and all creative materials were to be cleared from his daughter's room. He was systematically dismantling her inner world, turning her lavish bedroom into a beautifully appointed prison cell. And to complete this prison, he hired a new warden. Her name was Mrs. Eleanor Covington, a British woman in her 60s, with hair pulled into a severe bun and an unchanging uniform of gray. Her resume was impeccable, listing minor European royals and Swiss tycoons. Her specialty was managing difficult children through discipline and structure. She was the embodiment of everything Julian believed in. She was not a friend. She was an administrator. "Your job," Julian instructed her in his mahogany-paneled office, "is to ensure she adheres to her therapy schedules and exhibits no unusual behaviors, no encouragement of fantasy, only reality." The fortress of silence was now reinforced. Seraphina retreated completely, a ghost in her own home. She stopped eating, the weight visibly falling from her small frame. Sometimes, late at night, Mrs. Covington would hear strange, low humming sound from her room, not a melody, but the wounded sound of an animal trying to soothe itself. But Julian didn't see it. He saw only that the silence had returned, and to him, that was a victory. He was burying the truth under layers of denial. He was, however, unaware that outside his walls, a counteroffensive was being meticulously planned. Maya Evans did not go to a standard law firm. She went to Loft in Greenwich Village, the office of Marcus Thorne. Marcus was more than a civil rights attorney. He was a master strategist, a shark in a bespoke suit who had toppled corporations and exposed corrupt politicians. "They always underestimate us, Maya," Marcus said after watching the first video of Seraphina explaining relativity using her dolls. "It's their fatal flaw." Julian Sterling looks at you and sees an affordable black nanny. He doesn't see a dual honors graduate from Juilliard and NYU. He doesn't see an expert. Their plan was not a small claims lawsuit for wrongful termination. It was grander. "We're not going after his assets," Marcus explained, pacing his office. "We're going after the one thing he values more, his legacy, his reputation. We won't take him to court. We'll put him on trial in a court with far more power, the court of his peers and public opinion." Their first move was a letter delivered by courier to Julian Sterling's office, on the letterhead of NYU's prestigious Child Study Center. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation to attend an independent presentation on new approaches to selective mutism, featuring a notable case study, Seraphina Sterling. The letter was signed by Dr. Alastair Finch, the uncrowned king of child psychology, a name that commanded respect and fear in New York's elite circles. Back in the penthouse, something unexpected was happening. Mrs. Covington, the enforcer of discipline, began to see the truth. Her professional, I told her that Seraphina wasn't a difficult child. She was a suffering one. One night, while tidying the room, she found something hidden beneath the edge of a Persian rug, a small, leather-bound notebook. Inside was not writing, but a complex system of symbols, a cipher of Seraphina's own invention. Mrs. Covington, who had a brief, youthful history with cryptography at MI6, spent the night painstakingly decoding it. What she found sent a chill down her spine. These were not a child's idle thoughts. They were haikus about the color of silence, complex mathematical equations, and one question repeated over and over: when is Maya coming back? At that same moment, Julian received a letter from NYU. He read it, and for the first time in days, his mask of confident control cracked. This was not an attack from a disgruntled nanny. This was a siege orchestrated by people who were his equals, or perhaps his superiors. Dr. Finch's name on the page was not an invitation. It was a summons. The conference room at NYU Child Study Center was nothing like Julian Sterling's corporate boardroom. There was no polished mahogany or supple leather, only sterile white walls, cold fluorescent lighting, and a long, utilitarian table. The air itself was thick with academic gravitas, a kind of power that Julian's money could not buy. He sat at one end, flanked by his lawyer, a man famous for making the problems of the wealthy disappear. Today, however, the lawyer's usual confident smirk was absent. Opposite them sat a formidable alliance. Marcus Thorne, with the sharp, predatory smile of a hunter, Maya Evans, as calm and solid as a rock, and at the center, Dr. Alastair Finch. Dr. Finch, a man with a mane of silver hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense, began the presentation without any social preamble. His voice was placid, but every word carried the weight of decades of authority. Mr. Sterling, he began, we've invited you here today because we have new, groundbreaking findings related to cognitive development in children diagnosed with selective mutism. Your daughter, Seraphina, is central to this research. Julian's lawyer immediately objected. Dr. Finch, my client, did not consent to his daughter being part of any study. This is a violation of her privacy. Marcus Thorne simply smiled. Not quite. New York state law allows for independent expert evaluation when there is credible evidence that a gifted child's development is being actively suppressed. And we have that evidence. Marcus nodded to Maya. She connected a laptop to the large screen on the wall, and the symphony of truth began. The overture was a video clip. It showed Seraphina and Maya in the park. Maya pointed to ducks on a pond, asking a question in fluent French. Seraphina answered back, also in French, effortlessly describing the migratory patterns of waterfowl with the vocabulary of an adolescent. Julian sat stunned into silence. He never knew his daughter spoke French. The first movement, Allegro. The next video played. Seraphina was on her bedroom floor, surrounded by Lego blocks. But she wasn't building a house. She was assembling a complex model of a DNA double helix, explaining to Maya the base pairings of adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. Her voice was filled with the pure, unadulterated passion of a true scientist. Julian's lawyer stammered. This could be staged. She could have been coached. Dr. Finch shook his head gently. A 6-year-old cannot be coached into a conceptual understanding of molecular genetics, sir. But if you require further proof. The second movement, Adagio. The screen went dark, replaced by an audio recording. There was no image, only sound. It was Seraphina's voice, whispering to Maya one evening. Maya, does Daddy love me? Of course he does, sweet girl. He loves you very much. Then why? Why does he tell the doctors I'm a disappointment? I heard him. On the phone. He said I was a non-recoupable investment. A profound silence fell over the room. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. He remembered that call. He had thought he was alone in his study. His daughter's whispered words, full of pain and confusion, were more damning than any legal accusation. The crescendo, the final, devastating blow. The conference room door opened. Mrs. Covington, the warden Julian had hired, walked in. She did not look at Julian. She walked directly to Dr. Finch and placed Seraphina's small notebook on the table. "I was hired to supervise the child," Mrs. Covington stated, her voice firm, no longer that of an employee but of a witness. "But my highest duty is to protect the child. This is Seraphina's journal. It's written in a cipher she created herself." Dr. Finch opened the notebook. He read aloud a few entries that Mrs. Covington had already deciphered. "October 10th, Daddy tore up my music again. He thinks that if he tears the paper, the song dies. But it doesn't. It just gets sadder inside my head. October 15th, Mrs. C brought me a book about the stars. I wish I could be a star, so far away that no one can hear your silence." Julian Sterling was no longer sitting upright. He slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. The final wall of his denial had crumbled into dust. He wasn't a father trying to protect his child. He was a vandal. He was the monster in his own daughter's story. Marcus Thorne let the silence stretch, allowing the full weight of the truth to settle upon Julian. Then, he placed one last file on the table. "Based on this evidence," Marcus said, his voice cold and precise, "we have officially filed a petition with the Administration for Children's Services requesting an emergency investigation into emotional abuse and developmental suppression. Dr. Finch has agreed to serve as their expert witness." He paused, looking directly into Julian's eyes. "You may have all the money in the world, Mr. Sterling, but as of today, you no longer have the final say in Seraphina's future. The court will." The power dynamic had been spectacularly, irrevocably reversed. Julian, the man who commanded worlds, was now utterly powerless. And Maya, the dismissed and disdained nanny, now held the key to his daughter's future. News of the presentation at NYU didn't explode in the tabloids. It spread in a far more insidious way, through hushed whispers at private clubs, meaningful glances at charity galas, and phone calls that abruptly ended when Julian entered a room. His empire wasn't collapsing with a bang, but through the slow, merciless erosion of his reputation. Business partners became distant. Social invitations dwindled. Julian Sterling's fortress was no longer a symbol of power, but an island of isolation. The Administration for Children's Services, ACS, descended with the terrifying efficiency of a state agency. They were not impressed by the Rothko paintings or the Persian rugs. They saw a child's room stripped of all creative tools. They interviewed Carmen, the housekeeper, who tearfully recounted the moment Julian had torn his daughter's music to shreds. They interviewed Mrs. Covington, who provided the decoded journal as irrefutable proof. Julian was now trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare that his money could not solve. He was forced into psychological evaluations. His lawyer, who once promised he could handle anything, now spoke only of mitigating damages. The threat of losing custody entirely became a tangible specter, haunting his days and nights. By temporary court order, a strange and painful arrangement was enacted. Seraphina would remain in the penthouse, but Julian was no longer her sole authority. Maya Evans was appointed as her educational and emotional guardian, granted unrestricted access and reporting directly to the court. The piano was returned to Seraphina's room. The books, the drawing pads, and the Lego blocks were all reinstated. The world Julian had tried to erase was being rebuilt before his very eyes, and its architect was the woman he had dismissed and fired. Maya's presence in his home was a quiet, constant torture for Julian. She was not triumphant. She was simply there, her focus entirely on Seraphina. He would hear them reading together in German, watch them build complex molecular models, and listen to the sound of new melodies drifting from his daughter's room, sounds he was never a part of. He was a stranger in his own home. His true breaking point did not happen in a courtroom, but in a small therapy office with bland, beige walls. The mandatory family session. Julian, Seraphina, and Maya sat in a tense, imperfect circle with the court-appointed therapist, Dr. Lena Hansen. Julian tried to speak. He had rehearsed apologies with his lawyer, carefully chosen words that would convey remorse without admitting too much legal liability. But when he looked into Seraphina's clear eyes, all the prepared sentences evaporated. She wasn't looking at him with hatred. That was the worst part. She was looking at him with a profound emptiness, as if he were just part of the furniture. His throat closed. The man who could command a multinational corporation could not utter a single, simple sentence. Dr. Hansen gently turned to Seraphina. "Sarah, is there anything you'd like to say to your father?" Seraphina was silent for a long moment. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then she shook her head. Julian felt a cold, final despair wash over him. He had lost her forever. But then Seraphina did something unexpected. She slipped off her chair, not to leave, but to walk to a small table in the corner. She picked up a blank sheet of paper and a crayon. She didn't write. She drew. She drew two stick figures. A large one, tall and rigid, standing inside a box. A smaller one, standing outside the box, holding out its hand. She brought the drawing over and placed it in Julian's lap. Julian stared at the simple, powerful image. He understood it instantly. He was the one in the box of his pride, his fear, his suffocating expectations. And his daughter, the child he had tried to imprison, was on the outside, reaching for him. It was the moment everything broke. Not the fall of an empire, but the shattering of a man. The hot tears he had suppressed for weeks began to stream down his face. He no longer tried to hide them. His voice broke, a ragged whisper directed not at the therapist, but at the drawing, at his daughter. I'm the one in the box, aren't I?" Seraphina gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, the words finally breaking free, no longer calculated, but torn from a place of deep, ruinous grief. "I'm so sorry I built it. I was so scared. I was scared that you were different. I was scared people would think I was a failure. My fear was so big. It trapped us both. I'm sorry, Seraphina. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to step out." He bowed his head, his tears splashing onto the drawing. Silence descended. Then a small, hesitant sound broke through it. For the first time in that room, Seraphina spoke. "I can help you find the way out." It was just one sentence, but it was not an accusation or a condition. It was an offer, an invitation, an act of grace far beyond anything he deserved. Julian looked up, seeing his daughter through a blur of tears. He saw not a genius, not a victim, but a soul of immense generosity. She didn't want revenge. She wanted to heal. He held out his hands, a hesitant, uncertain gesture. Seraphina stepped forward, and for the first time since she was a toddler, she willingly wrapped her arms around her father's neck. It was an awkward, clumsy embrace, but it was real. It was forgiveness. Maya and Dr. Hansen watched the sacred moment in silence. This was not the result of a legal strategy. This was the miracle of courage, the courage of a child who dared to reach out, and the courage of a father who finally dared to take her hand. 6 months later, the penthouse on Park Avenue was still a space of immense luxury, but the oppressive, controlled silence was gone. In its place was a new kind of sound, the rise and fall of a piano, peals of laughter, and the occasional, lively debate over whether or not a black hole could sing. The ivory-white Steinway Grand was no longer a sterile showpiece. It was now covered in handwritten sheet music, some pieces finished, others mere fragments of ideas. The walls no longer exclusively held expensive art. Interspersed between the Rothkos and de Koonings were Seraphina's own drawings of swirling galaxies, abstract mathematical patterns, and even a few playful caricatures of her father with perpetually messy hair. The story's final scene did not take place in a courtroom or at an award ceremony. It unfolded on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. Julian Sterling, having shed his power suit for an old hoodie and jeans, was on his knees on the floor. He and Seraphina were assembling a complex model of the International Space Station. Julian's fingers, once so adept at signing multi-million-dollar contracts, now fumbled with the tiny plastic pieces. "Dad, you've put the Zarya module on wrong," Seraphina said, her voice now confident and fluid. She pointed to the instruction manual. "It's supposed to connect to Unity, not Zvezda. You weren't paying attention." Julian laughed, a genuine, unforced sound. "My apologies, boss. My mind was on the quarterly reports." Quarterly reports aren't as important as astronauts having air to breathe, Seraphina replied with mock seriousness, then gave him a mischievous wink, a gesture she had picked up from Maya. A subtle but profound shift had occurred. Julian was no longer trying to teach or lead his daughter. He was learning from her. He had accepted that in many areas, his daughter was smarter than he was, and the realization did not diminish him. It made him whole. Maya Evans was still a part of their lives, but her role had evolved. She was no longer the court-appointed guardian. She was a friend, a mentor, a member of their strange, cobbled-together family. She was preparing for her doctoral program, her research proposal based on Seraphina's extraordinary journey. She entered the room now, carrying a plate of cookies. "How's the space station coming along?" "My father is about to cause an international incident in low Earth orbit," Seraphina announced, her eyes sparkling. Julian held up his hands in surrender. "I admit defeat. I'll stick to my designated role." "And what role is that?" Maya asked, smiling. Julian didn't answer with words. He stood up and walked over to the piano. He didn't sit on the bench. He stood beside it, like a stagehand waiting in the wings. Seraphina understood immediately. She ran to the piano, her small fingers gliding over the keys, sounding out a searching, complex chord full of anticipation. Then she looked up, not at Maya, but at her father. "My concerto," she said. "I'm stuck on the transition. I need someone to turn the pages and to listen." It was an offer and a test. Julian took a deep breath. He looked into his daughter's eyes and saw in them forgiveness and an invitation. He nodded, a single, certain gesture. "I'm here," he said, his voice low and warm. "Play, Sera. I won't miss a single note." The perspective pulls back slightly, capturing the moment. Maya stands in the doorway, a quiet smile on her face, witnessing her true victory. The final image is a powerful, living contrast. Seraphina's small, nimble hands dancing across the keys, creating a melody that is new, hopeful, and still taking shape. And beside her, Julian's large, strong hands, no longer controlling or commanding, but waiting patiently, ready to turn the next page in the score of his daughter's life and of his own. The music swells, not a perfect, triumphant fanfare, but a piece still being written, with its own rises and falls, its hesitations and its surprising harmonies. It is the sound of healing. Julian learned that the greatest treasures are often hidden behind our own prejudices. Here at Toch Story, we believe every story has a powerful truth waiting to be discovered. If you agree, please help our community grow by giving this video a like, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and hitting that subscribe button. Your support allows us to bring more stories like Seraphina's to light.